Okay, good morning. It's time for our next lesson. I hope you guys are doing really, really well. I miss hanging out with you guys, and I know it's difficult doing this whole distance learning thing, but I think we'll make it through it. Please email me or contact me if you've got any prayer requests. I'd love to share with the rest of the class, if you'd like to for us to pray for you. But if it's something you just want me to pray for you one-on-one, let me know that too. I want to make sure that in this time of need that I am here for you guys, your family as well. So if there's something I could pray for your family, let me know. All right, so I want us to go ahead and jump into our lesson. Go ahead and open up your book to chapter 23. And let's see here, I should have already had this opened up. Chapter 24. I apologize, we did 23 last week. Chapter 24, it's on page 193. And we're going to be talking about something called the ablative absolute. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys so you can see a PowerPoint that I put together for you. And hopefully this will work out for us here. I'm going to put it on play. And hopefully that's working there. This is ablative absolutes. All right, so before we kick off here, we review with you guys participles. Where each lesson we basically build off of the previous lesson. And last week we learned about participles. Participles are verbs that function like adjectives, and as such they look like verbs in some instances. They're formed from the fourth principal part for the most part, at least in the passive perfect and the future active. We looked at the forms last week. I don't want to get in that right now. Go back and review if you have any questions. But they also act like adjectives, so they look like adjectives, and they have case, gender, and number on their endings to help you understand how they function in the sentence and what they're describing. So today we're going to be talking about ablative of absolute. So let's jump into the slideshow and see what is an ablative of absolute. The ablative absolute is a noun participle construction. So it's made up of a noun and a participle that is in a subordinate clause. In other words, it's not in the main sentence. It's part of a dependent clause, usually at the beginning of the sentence, that it is only loosely connected with the action or the verb in the main sentence. So it's only partially connected. So you're gonna have this phrase at the beginning of the sentence, usually at the beginning, and it's only loosely connected to the main sentence. What does that look like? Well, before we tell you what that looks like, you may be wondering about the word absolute. Why is this called an ablative absolute? Here's the reason why. The word absolutum in Latin means loosened from or separated. Thus, the noun participle phrase at the beginning of the sentence is only loosely connected or separated from the main sentence. A comma generally always is present to separate the phrase from the main sentence. Now, I know it may be a little confusing, but we'll show you an example here, and I think you'll get it. So to be clear, an ablative absolute is a noun participle construction that's in the ablative case. I think I probably should have put that in that definition. It's in the ablative case. It's in a subordinate clause, and it's loosely connected to the main sentence. So let's see what this looks like. All right. Let's take this sentence here. It's pretty simple. It's only 4 words. Roma, visa, viri, godabant. Okay, let's take a look at this. We're going to separate those words just a little bit. So you've got 2 words separated by a comma, Roma, visa, separating the rest of the sentence, viri, godabant. Now, you probably have already figured out that the second half of this sentence, viri, godabant, looks like your main sentence, and it is. Viri is obviously your subject, plural, nominative, the word men, and godabant is your verb. It's an active imperfect, active imperfect, what am I missing? Oh, indicative, sorry. Third person plural, so it's the men rejoice. But what about the first part of this sentence? Roma visa. Let's take a look at this. First off, you've got a noun here. It's in the ablative case, singular, Roma. You can tell it's in the ablative case because it has that macron, the long mark over the A, Roma. Well, visa, look, it's got a long mark over the A too. It's also an ablative, and but it's not just an an ablative. If you notice, it probably comes from the word vidao, videri, vidi, visus, That's the fourth principal part. And of course, you form the participle, the passive perfect participle, from the fourth principal part. So instead of visus, you have visa. The ending is the long A, ablative singular feminine. And it's modifying the word Roma. This participle, this verb, is acting as an adjective. It's modifying the word Rome, so it has to have the same case number and gender. Therefore, it's feminine ablative singular with the long A, just like Roma is in the ablative feminine singular. So Roma visa. All right, and as we already mentioned, the word weary is a subject noun. It's nominative case plural. And of course, your verb, main verb, is the active, indicative, imperfect, third person plural. So what do we do with this? All right, well, let's look at the basic translation for each individual word. All right, Roma, it's ablative. So remember, it's like by, with, or from. So we're just going to go with Rome. Visa, well, since it's the passive perfect participle, you translate it having been seen. This had been the present participle active, you would have said seeing, but this is having been seen. The action is being done to that person or that thing, having been seen. And of course, men and were rejoicing. All right, so let's put this together before I move forward here. Notice that the ablative absolute is the combination of a noun participle in the ablative case, Roma visa. That's your ablative absolute. So how do we translate that? Here's the basic literal translation. With Rome, having been seen, comma, the men were rejoicing. So in other words, the men, as they saw Rome, maybe they were sailing up Tiber River, or maybe they were on the Appian Way and they're marching towards Rome, and they see Rome and they get excited. With Rome having been seen, the men were rejoicing. Problem is, that sounds really awkward in English, doesn't it? So there's other possibilities of how to translate that. Let's take a look at this. With Rome having been seen, the literal translation there, the men were rejoicing, with Rome having been seen. But usually in English, we're going to substitute the preposition with three other or several other different kinds of prepositions that will make better sense. When, since, and although. There are a couple others which I'll show you in a minute, but when, since, or although are some of the main ones that you will use to substitute with the word with, the preposition with. So it may sound better to say, when Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. That already sounds a little bit better. You could say, since Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. Or you could say, although Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. Now, technically, this one doesn't work really well in this particular sense, and I'll tell you why in just a minute, because it has a more of an adversative effect, but I'll explain that in a minute. So let's talk about these other possibilities. And I have to apologize. I think this window is right on top of the title, but that's okay. It just simply says participles. The key to translating the tense of the participle, I'm sitting here trying to read this and I'm focusing on what's going down at the bottom of the screen. The key is to translate the tense of the participle relative to the time or tense of the main verb. We talked about that already. You'll remember that if the main verb is in the present tense and the, let me just use perfect tense, for example, or imperfect, let's say imperfect. So if the action in the main verb is happening in the past, right? But the participle or the subordinate verb that we've looked at before is in the present tense, it has to be happening at the same time back here in the past as the main verb. But if it's a perfect verb, that means it's happening before the action of the main verb, which if it's in the past, then it's like a pluperfect. So let's take a look at this here. You can see that Roma visa is using the passive perfect participle. The main verb is in the imperfect. So in other words, the main verb, imperfect, means it's happening. Remember, here's your timeline. It's happening in the past, right? But because the tense of the participle is in the perfect, that means it's the past. So it's in the pluperfect. It happens before the action of the past. So if you remember, we translate that like it's pluperfect. So in other words, you would translate this, proper tense, when Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. Even though literally you would say with Rome having been seen, that's not the way you're going to translate, because you have to translate the tense relative to the main verb. When Rome had been seen, then the men were rejoicing, if that makes sense. All right. So I talked about there's different kinds of ways to translate this. We'll let that finish doing its thing, and I want you to kind of look at me here for a second to make sure you understand this. If you remember, there's different ways to translate, for instance, different kinds of cases. like genitive. You had genitive possession, genitive of description. For ablative, we had like ablative of time. We had ablative of cardinal numbers. We've had ablative of means, ablative of manner. Remember all of those? So in other words, you can have a case, but it has different nuances based on its specific function in that particular sentence. Well, this is true with ablative of absolute. I want you to think about this. There's a difference between saying when the men saw Rome, they were rejoicing, versus since the men saw, or since they saw Rome, the men were rejoicing. Those are two different things, and we're going to talk about that. The first kind of relationship is a temporal relationship. In other words, it has to do with time. So the example here again, when Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. So this is, again, using the ablative absolute as in the perfect participle. So it's happening before the action of the main verb. So when Rome had been seen, then the men were rejoicing. Or even better, after Rome had been seen. So this is another preposition you can use. After the men had been seen, after the Rome had been seen, the people were rejoicing. Now, what happens if the participle is in the present tense? It still works the same way. But this time you would say, as Rome was seen. So in other words, it's as it was happening, the men were rejoicing. It's happening at the same time. That would be if you had the participle in the present tense. And then you could also use the word preposition while Rome was seen. So can you see the difference between using when and after versus as or while? That has to do with clarifying time. And that's all going to be based on the tense of the participle in relationship to the tense of the main verb. Now, there are other kinds of relationships that come into play here that don't have anything really to do with time. You can have a causal relationship between the ablative absolute and the main verb. So in other words, since Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. This has to do with cause and effect. The fact that they saw Rome caused them to rejoice. So it's a cause and effect relationship. And because of that, the word preposition since would be better to translate here. Since Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. And then the last one here I mentioned a minute ago, using the word although, it has more to do with an adversative effect. So let's take a look at that. Adversative relationship. Although Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. This has to do with juxtapositioning two different ideas, two different things. Now, this would work if the fact that, let's say, I don't know, maybe they're slaves and they're about to be sold into slavery in Rome. So they shouldn't be excited about going to Rome, but maybe they haven't had food or water for the last 2 weeks, and they know the fact that they're getting to Rome means they're going to eat or drink. I don't know, I'm just trying to make something up here. But that means they would be thinking, we shouldn't be excited about seeing Rome, but we kind of are. So although Rome had been seen, the men were rejoicing. So that's how you translate ablative of absolutes. The two things are to remember is that the ablative absolute is a noun participle construction in the ablative case, loosely connected with the main verb in the main sentence, and it's usually separated by a comma. And you will translate this based on the context of the sentence. So whether you use when, after, as, while, or since, that has to do with context. And then also based on the time of the tense of the verb will also help you to indicate which one of these you use. I think that's the last slide for this lesson. It is. I'm going to stop here. And today you're going to focus just on this first part on page 193 and 194. Tomorrow we're going to look at the passive periphrastic. We'll talk about that tomorrow. See you later. I promise I'm going as soon as I get all this stopped.